Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Claire no way imagined that the worst night of her life would begin so still, with the hum of the streetlights outdoors and the vision that Genoa City was eventually giving her a moment of peace, but that vision shattered. The alternate rough hands seized her from before and dragged her into the darkness, her laugh swallowed by the roar of a machine and the suffocating terror that wrapped around her casket as she realized she had been taken, abducted, cancelled from the world she knew. In a matter of seconds, and as the van sped down and horror clawed at her throat, she told herself this was arbitrary, a mistake, an agony that would end if she just stayed calm. But also came the moment that changed everything, the moment that turned fear into commodity far worse, commodity deeply particular and ruinous, because nearly between the blindfold snapping into place and the cold essence bottom beneath her shaking with every afar, one of her abductors spoke a single name. Casually, nearly carelessly, as if it meant nothing, and yet to Claire it meant everything, because that name was arbitrary, was accidental, was commodity non-native should ever know, and the moment it left his mouth her blood ran cold, her breath caught, and her entire world began to collapse in slow, horrifying detail, as she realized this hijacking was about plutocrat, or influence, or chance. It was about her history, about secrets she allowed were buried ever. Because the name they said was a name tied to treason, to blood, to a history she had spent times trying to overrun, and hearing it spoken in that dark, moving captivity felt like being picked with the verity that no matter how far she ran, no matter how hard she tried to rewrite her story, the history had set up her, hunted her, and now had its hands around her throat. Claire's mind contended as she replayed every connection, every warning she ignored, every uneasy feeling she brushed away, realizing too late that the signs were there each on, that someone had been watching her, studying her, staying for the perfect moment to strike, and as the van eventually stopped and she was dragged into an strange place, the walls closing in, the air thick with peril, the name echoed again, this time louder, further deliberate, and that was when the full weight of the disclosure crushed her, because the name wasn't just someone she knew, it was someone who defined her. Someone whose shadow impended over every chapter of her life, someone whose involvement meant this wasn't just a hijacking, it was a reckoning, a communication, a warning that the verity was coming whether she was ready or not, and as fear gave way to shock, also wrathfulness, also a bone-deep dread, Claire realized that whoever was behind this didn't just want control over her body, they wanted control over her story, over her identity, over the veritably core of who she was. And the terror of that knowledge was far worse than the conditions smelling into her wrists or the cold wave, strange room she was thrown into, because now she knew she wasn't just a victim, she was a target, chosen with purpose, and every second that passed brought her near to a verity that could destroy not only her, but everyone she loved. Trapped alone with her studies, Claire replayed the name again and again, each reiteration shelling back layers of denial and forcing her to defy recollections she had locked down, moments of pain and deception that suddenly made sense in an intimidating new light, and she wondered who differently knew, who differently was involved, how deep this conspiracy went, because if her abductors knew that name, also they knew far further than they were letting on, and the idea that her life had been counterplotted out by unseen hands transferred a fresh surge of fear through her. Indeed, as she plotted to stay strong, to stay focused, to survive long enough to fight back. Meanwhile, nearly in Genoa City, the people who loved Claire felt the shift before they indeed knew she was missing, an imperturbable sense that commodity was terribly wrong, and as the hours ticked by and the verity of her exposure surfaced, the race to find her would begin, but none of them could conceivably imagine the horror she was facing, or the ruinous power of that one name, the name that tied this agony to a once reproach, a retired alliance, a secret that was no way meant to see the light of day. And when Claire eventually heard her abductors argue about what to do with her coming, about whether he would be satisfied or whether she knew too important, it came chillingly clear that her fate rested on opinions being made far beyond that room, opinions embedded in old grievances and untreated business, and the consummation that she was a pawn in a much larger game made her feel lower and further helpless than ever ahead. Yet nearly deep outside, beneath the fear and shock, a spark of defiance burned, because if they allowed breaking her spirit would be easy, they were wrong, and indeed as the name continued to hang her, indeed as it shattered her visions and forced her to defy a verity she no way wanted to face, Claire pledged that if she survived this, nothing would ever be the same, because the moment that name was spoken, her old life ended, and whatever came next, deliverance, vengeance, or disclosure, would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone connected to that name, that secret. That intimidating verity that had eventually come out of the murk and claimed her in the most brutal way imaginable. Claire lost all sense of time after that, the darkness of the room swallowing twinkles and hours likewise until fear came the only constant she could measure, but the name her abductors had spoken kept circling her studies like a shark, tearing at recollections she had tried to bury, because it wasn't just a name tied to her history, it was the name that explained everything she had no way been suitable to explain, the unforeseen discoveries, the half-trueness, the moments when people around her went silent the alternate she entered a room, and now, sitting on a cold bottom with her back against a wall that smelled of rust and damp concrete, she eventually understood that her life had no way truly been her own, that it had been shaped and shadowed by forces she slightly comprehended. And that this hijacking wasn't the morning of the agony but the ineluctable climax of a story that had started long before she was ready to face it, when the door eventually opened again and light revealed in, bedazzling and cruel, one of the abductors squinched in front of her and repeated the name sluggishly, designedly, watching her response like a scientist observing an instance, and when her silence verified everything he demanded to know, his boo told her that her fear was exactly what they wanted, because this wasn't about rooting information presently, it was about watching her break under the weight of the verity, about forcing her to defy the reality that the person she trusted, the person she stressed, the person whose name visited her dreams, had orchestrated this moment from hence, and as the abductor leaned closer and rumored that he's been staying a long time for this, Claire's stomach dropped, the recrimination crashing over her like a surge, because staying meant planning, tolerance, preoccupation, and that meant this wasn't impulsive or reckless, it was precise, calculated, and ruinous, she allowed. Of all the times she'd induced herself she was safe, all the times she believed she had eventually escaped that shadow, and the bitter irony made her casket pang, because safety had been envisioned, a taradiddle she told herself to survive, and now the taradiddle had been ripped down, leaving her exposed and scarified, yet also strangely clear-headed, because once the worst verity is revealed, there's nothing left to fear but survival itself, the abductors argued again, voices raised. And she caught fractions of their discussion, deadlines, prospects, consequences, and each word verified her growing dubitation. That this wasn't meant to end still, that her exposure was supposed to shoot a communication to someone important, someone who would understand exactly what that name meant and why Claire was the perfect influence, and as dread settled deep in her bones, she realized the real peril wasn't just what they might do to her, but what they might force her to come, because if she survived, she'd no way be suitable to return to ignorance, no way again pretend she didn't know how important power that name carried or how numerous lives it had formerly destroyed. Nearly far down, the hunt for Claire boosted, phones chimed, alliances shifted, and secrets were pulled into the open as those closest to her began to realize that this wasn't a simple hijacking, that it was tied to commodity darker and aged than any of them wanted to admit, and as names were rumored and propositions formed, the same name that shattered Claire's world began to ripple outward, transferring shockwaves through Genoa City, exposing cracks in connections that had sounded unbreakable, and forcing long-suppressed trueness to claw their way to the face. Back in prison, Claire was eventually given food and water, small courtesies that felt more like taunts than kindness, and as she ate mechanically, she studied every movement, every habit, every weakness, because if there was one thing she knew now, it was that she couldn't stay to be saved, not when her fate was tied to someone who thrived on control and manipulation. And as she erected together the fractions she'd eavesdropped, an intimidating consummation began to form, that the name wasn't just connected to her history, it was connected to her future, to a plan that needed her alive, apprehensive, and emotionally shattered, and that knowledge gave her a dangerous kind of power, because if they demanded her conscious, demanded her hysterical, also she wasn't disposable, at least not yet, when one of the abductors slipped and mentioned a meeting, a transfer, a moment when he would eventually see her face to face. Claire felt her heart race, because the idea of coming face to face with the person behind this, the person whose name had destroyed her sense of tone, was both horrifying and strangely grounding, as if the abstract terror of the unknown was eventually taking shape, giving her commodity palpable to fight against. And in that moment she made a decision that surprised indeed Herself, she would survive not just to escape, but to defy, to look that name in the eye and refuse to let it define her any longer. Prostration ultimately dragged her into a shallow sleep, visited by recollections and half-formed plans, and when she woke to crying and chaos outside the room, she knew commodity had shifted, that the timepiece was ticking faster now, and whether that meant deliverance was close or her convicts were preparing their coming move, she couldn't tell, but one thing was certain: the agony was raising, and the name that had shattered her world was about to be spoken openly, intimately, with consequences that would ripple far beyond that room. As steps thundered closer and the door burst open formally more, Claire braced herself, not just for what was coming, but for who was coming, because the moment that name was revealed, truly revealed, to everyone, there would be no going back, no further secrets, no further half-trueness, only the raw, ruinous fallout of a verity that had been too important to stay buried, and whether she surfaced from this as a survivor, a pawn, or a catalyst for destruction, Claire knew one thing with absolute certainty: the name her abductors had spoken was no longer just an armament against her, it was a ticking lemon, and when it eventually exploded, nothing and no bull would be left unchanged. The pressure snapped when the chaos outside her door grew louder, sharper, edged with urgency, and Claire felt it in her casket before she understood it in her mind, that spontaneous mindfulness that the balance had shifted and whatever fragile control her convicts believed they had was slipping through their fritters. Because the voices arguing now weren't confident presently, they were panicked, cropped, concentrated with fear of consequences, and that fear told Claire commodity. Pivotal, someone important was closing in, someone who had either discovered the verity or decided that silence was no longer respectable, and as the door slammed shut again and the steps retreated, she exhaled sluggishly, forcing herself to stay predicated, because fear would only make her weak and weakness was exactly what they wanted. Yet indeed, as she fought to steady herself, the name echoed again in her studies, louder now, heavier, because every second that passed made it clearer that this wasn't just about what that name meant to her, but what it meant to everyone differently, to the web of falsehoods and alliances that had been spun around it for times, and the horrifying verity was that by saying that name out loud, her abductors had formally exploded commodity they could no longer control. Claire began to notice the small changes that came with that consummation, the way her convicts checked their phones more frequently, the way they avoided looking at her directly, as if she were no longer just a hostage but a liability, a walking memorial of a secret that refused to stay buried, and it actualized on her that the real peril might not be what they planned to do with her, but what they would do if they decided she knew too important, if the balance sloped from influence to loose end, and that study transferred a bite through her that had nothing to do with the cold concrete beneath her. Yet indeed that fear was stoned by commodity differently now, clarity, because formerly the vision shattered. Once the verity clawed its way into the light, there was a strange strength in knowing exactly what you were over against. Recollections she formerly dismissed as concurrents rearranged themselves into patterns she could no longer ignore, moments when doors had opened too fluently, when protection appeared out of nowhere, when warnings came wrapped in concern but laced with trouble, and the consummation that her entire life had been still managed, nudged, controlled by the influence behind that name made her stomach twist with equal corridor rage and grief, because it meant the choices she allowed were hers might no way have been entirely free, and the treason of that understanding cut deeper than any physical detriment ever could, nearly beyond the walls of her confinement. The fallout boosted as well, because secrets like this no way stay contained, and the moment that name resurfaced, it set off admonitions in places Claire had no way indeed imagined, drawing the attention of people who had spent times pretending they were done with the history, people who suddenly realized that the history was veritably important, alive and demanding answers, and as whispers turned into competitions and denials turned into hopeless apologies, the verity began to fracture connections that had formerly sounded untouchable, exposing the spoilage beneath the face and forcing long-standing power players to choose sides, because impartiality was no longer an option. Back in the room, Claire tested her conditions again, subtle this time, regular, not because she believed escape would be easy, but because she refused to surrender to helplessness, and in doing so she caught commodity important. The knot on one of the tapes had been rushed, sloppier than ahead, a small detail that spoke volumes about the pressure her convicts were under. And that bitsy fault came a lifeline, not because it guaranteed freedom, but because it proved that fear had made them careless, and careless people make miscalculations. When one of the abductors eventually returned, his bravado was gone, replaced by vexation and slightly concealed anxiety, and when he spoke the name again, this time with resentment rather of confidence, Claire understood that indeed they were beginning to realize the peril of the game they were playing, because invoking that name wasn't protection presently, it was exposure, and the power they allowed it gave them was eroding with every fleeting hour. He advised her not to try anything, not to suppose she had the upper hand, but the warning chimed concave, because the Verity was formerly doing what brute force no way could, it was destabilizing everything, and Claire saw it easily now, saw that her survival wasn't just about abundance, it was about timing, about understanding that the nearer the Verity came to daylight, the more changeable her convicts would come, and unpredictability cut both ways. Prostration hovered to pull her under again, but she defied sleep, knowing that mindfulness was her only real defense, and in the quiet moments she began to plan not just escape, but exposure, because if she got out of this, if she made it back to the world that allowed it knew her, she couldn't pretend presently, couldn't tuck this Verity down for the sake of comfort or stability, not when that silence had allowed so important damage to be done, and the resoluteness forming inside her was as shocking as it was empowering, because she knew that speaking that name openly, reclaiming it from fear and secretiveness, would set off consequences she couldn't completely prognosticate, consequences that might bring her connections, safety, indeed her sense of identity, yet the indispensable, living under its shadow ever, felt like a slower kind of death. The hours dragged on until the air itself sounded to joggle with expectation, and when the sound of vehicles outdoors eventually grew unmistakable, machines footling, doors slamming, rushed voices cutting through the night, Claire felt her palpitation shaft, because this was it, the moment everything had been erecting toward, whether it meant a transfer, a battle, or a hopeless last move by people who were running out of options, and as she was yanked to her bases and dragged down a narrow corridor, the name was spoken again, this time like a curse, and she nearly laughed at the irony, because the very thing they had used to scarify her had come the thing that scarified them most. When she was shoved into another room and left alone, the silence pressed in on her, heavy and expectant, and she realized with astounding clarity that no matter what happened next, the world she knew was formerly gone, replaced by one far more dangerous and far more honest, because secrets this big do'n't get buried doubly, and whether the Verity surfaced through her voice or someone differently, it was coming, impregnable, and the shockwaves would reach every corner of her life. As she awaited, heart pounding, mind sharp despite the fear, Claire made a pledge to herself that felt like an anchor in the storm, that she'd not let that name define her as a victim, that she'd survive not just to escape, but to reclaim her story from the people who allowed they possessed it, and in that moment, as the door creaked open formerly more and murk revealed across the bottom, she understood that the agony was ending, it was transubstantiating, and the name that shattered her world was about to come the catalyst for a reckoning that no bone, least of all the person behind it, was prepared to face. The door didn't swing open with the violence Claire expected, instead, it crept inward slowly, deliberately, as if whoever stood on the other side wanted her to feel every second of anticipation, every heartbeat pounding in her ears, and when the light finally spilled across the floor, she lifted her chin, refusing to cower, because fear had already taken enough from her and she would not give it the satisfaction of taking her dignity too. Not now, not after everything she had endured, and the figure that stepped inside stopped just short of fully revealing himself, lingering in the shadows as if even he understood the power of presence, the weight of being seen, and when he finally spoke her name, not the name that had haunted her, but her name, spoken with familiarity and possession, it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold, because it confirmed what she had suspected all along, this was personal. Devastatingly so. He circled her slowly, words carefully chosen, explaining without truly explaining, hinting at motives wrapped in twisted justifications about protection and inevitability, about how everything that had happened was for her own good, and as he spoke, Claire felt the last pieces of denial crumble, because she recognized the voice now, recognized the cadence, the entitlement, the certainty of someone who had never been told no, and when he finally said the name again, fully, unapologetically, it felt like the ground dropped out from beneath her, not because it was new, but because hearing it from him confirmed the worst possible truth, that the name belonged to the architect of her pain, the one who had been pulling strings from the beginning, shaping events with a cold, strategic hand while pretending to be something else entirely. Anger flared hot and sharp, cutting through the fear like a blade, and Claire surprised herself by laughing, a short, bitter sound that echoed off the walls and seemed to catch him off guard, because laughter wasn't part of his script, defiance wasn't something he'd planned for, and in that moment she realized something important.